It started with a laugh. Not the kind that bubbles up from joy or genuine amusement, but the forced kind. The one people conjure when they're caught off guard, scrambling to seem okay. It had slipped out of me on a random Tuesday evening when my husband, Andrew, showed me something on his phone, a funny meme, maybe, or a video he thought I'd like. I can't even remember now. What I do remember is the smile faltering on his lips when he caught the tone of mine. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah, fine," I replied too quickly, offering him my best reassuring smile. But it wasn't fine. That laugh was the sound of a gut feeling I had been ignoring for months clawing its way to the surface. We'd been married for 5 years, together for over a decade. By now, I should have been able to explain away the late-night text notifications or the hushed phone calls he'd take in the other room. I told myself he was stressed from work, or maybe he just needed some space. After all, I wasn't perfect. Our lives had grown complicated, tangled in the threads of everyday obligations, and I wasn't the vibrant, carefree woman he'd first fallen for. At least, that's how I explained the distance between us. But that laugh. That tiny, cracked noise. It felt like the universe whispering, "Look again." And so, I did. It began with something small. One night, Andrew left his phone on the kitchen counter while he went to shower. My hands were trembling as I picked it up, flipping it over like it might bite me. I didn't know what I was looking for, but my stomach was already sinking. And there it was, a text from someone named Sophia. I told myself it was nothing. A work colleague, maybe. But curiosity gnawed at me. I clicked, and the thread opened like Pandora's box. At first, it was innocent, discussions about a project. But as I scrolled further back, the messages changed. Flirty emojis. Inside jokes I wasn't part of. And then the ones that stopped my breath, plans to meet. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow," was followed by a heart emoji that felt like a punch to my gut. I stared at the screen, the world spinning. I wanted to throw the phone, scream, wake him up and demand answers. But I couldn't move. My body was frozen in disbelief, my mind running through every moment, trying to make sense of it all. How could he? After everything? I didn't confront him that night. Instead, I started paying attention. Over the next few weeks, I pieced together a puzzle I never wanted to solve. He wasn't just seeing Sophia. He was seeing Marissa too, his cousin's wife. It was a double betrayal, wrapped in layers of secrecy and lies. I wanted to be wrong. I wanted this to be some mistake, a nightmare I could wake from. But the evidence piled up, whispered calls in the garage, receipts from expensive dinners I hadn't attended, and, finally, a charge for a hotel room during a weekend he was supposedly out of town for work. Almost a year has passed since that moment. Today, I'm ready to tell this story, not because I've made peace with it, but because keeping it inside has begun to feel like suffocating under my own silence. After that night, I became a detective in my own marriage. Andrew didn't seem to notice my sharper focus, which only confirmed what I suspected. He was confident in his ability to deceive me, or he simply didn't care. Maybe both. I started with his phone. He always kept it close, but there were moments of carelessness, times he left it charging in the kitchen or slipped it into his pocket after forgetting to lock the screen. I didn't dare touch it again directly, afraid of being caught, so I started watching instead. He had a pattern. Around 11 p.m., he'd sit in his recliner and scroll mindlessly through his apps. I'd hear the telltale ping of incoming messages, and his eyes would light up in a way that hadn't happened with me in months. It was Marissa. I was sure of it. Her name had popped up once when I'd glanced over his shoulder. I had laughed nervously. "Oh, what's Marissa up to? Organizing another family barbecue?" He'd quickly locked the screen, smiled, and said, she was asking about a gift for her sister. Nothing important. I should have asked why she needed him for advice about that. But I didn't. Instead, I filed it away, like another breadcrumb on the trail I was following. One evening, while Andrew was out, I went to his office. It was my first real dive into snooping, and my hands shook as I rifled through drawers. Most of it was benign: bills, work documents, scattered receipts. But tucked beneath a pile of papers, I found something that made my heart drop: an itinerary for a weekend trip to a bed and breakfast 100 miles away. The date? 3 months ago. The same weekend he'd told me he was at a work conference. What struck me wasn't just the lie, but the details. Couple spa package. Private dinner for 2. It felt tailored, intimate, everything I'd longed for in our relationship but hadn't received in years. I didn't cry. Not yet. Anger flared too brightly to leave room for tears. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the insult. Did he think I wouldn't notice? That I wasn't worth the effort of even hiding it well? Marissa, his cousin's wife, had always been in the periphery of our lives, friendly, bubbly, the type who knew everyone's business and made it her mission to bring people together. I'd envied her charisma at times, the way she'd sweep into a room and command attention. But now, every memory of her felt poisoned. I started dissecting moments from the past, looking for signs I might have missed. There was the time at a family wedding when Andrew and Marissa had disappeared for an hour, reappearing flushed and laughing about a misunderstanding in the kitchen. We were trying to help with the cake cutting. Marissa had exclaimed, but something in her tone felt off, forced. At the time, I brushed it aside. Now, I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. But what pushed me over the edge was a photo. A candid shot from last Thanksgiving, taken by her husband, Liam. It showed Andrew and Marissa standing a little too close, her hand brushing his arm, his smile not the kind he wore for family but something deeper. Intimate. My stomach churned every time I looked at it. I needed proof. Not for me, I had all the evidence my heart could handle, but for the inevitable confrontation. I didn't want to give him the chance to spin his way out of it. And so, I did what I once thought I'd never do: I hired a private investigator. The investigator, Lisa, was sharp and professional, her voice calm and matter-of-fact as we discussed the situation. "We'll start with phone records and follow his movements for the next couple of weeks," she explained. "If he's meeting her, we'll know." Waiting for the results was agony. Every day, I woke with a knot in my stomach, dreading what I might learn but desperate to know. The nights were worse. Andrew would kiss me goodnight with the same lips that had kissed her, climb into bed with me as if he weren't lying to my face. Then, the call came. Lisa's voice was steady as she laid out the facts. Over the past week, Andrew had visited Marissa 3 times, once at her home while her husband was away, once at a boutique hotel downtown, and once in the parking lot of a secluded park. The hotel left a clear paper trail, a single room booked in his name, with her car seen leaving hours later. I thanked Lisa, numb, and ended the call. The silence that followed felt like a living thing, pressing against me, stealing my breath. This was it. The truth I'd been chasing had finally caught up with me, and it was every bit as devastating as I'd feared. I didn't confront him that night. Instead, I sat in the dark, clutching the printed photos Lisa had given me, and whispered to the empty room, why wasn't I enough? The question hung in the air, unanswered. The morning after the investigator's call, I woke with a new kind of clarity. Knowing the truth felt like a double-edged sword, painful but oddly empowering. For months, I had been living in the shadows of suspicion, second-guessing myself, doubting my instincts. Now, the pieces fit. The betrayal was real, tangible, and it had a name: Marissa. Andrew breezed through breakfast, oblivious to the storm brewing within me. He hummed to himself as he buttered his toast, occasionally glancing at his phone. Watching him, I felt a surge of disgust. How could he be so casual, so unaffected, when I was barely holding myself together? I needed a plan. Over the next week, I moved quietly. My first call was to Liam, Marissa's husband. I debated whether to involve him, afraid of the fallout, but in the end, it felt like the right thing to do. He deserved to know, just as much as I had. When I called, Liam sounded surprised. "Hey, everything okay?" "Not really," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. I think we need to talk. Can we meet? He agreed, and we met at a coffee shop the next day. Liam looked tired, like a man carrying a weight he didn't know how to name. I wondered if he'd already begun to suspect something. I slid the photos across the table, my hands shaking slightly. I'm sorry, I said, as his face darkened with realization. I didn't know how else to tell you. For a moment, he said nothing, just stared at the evidence. Then, in a voice thick with restrained anger, he said, "How long?" "At least a few months," I replied. "But I think it might go back further." "I found a photo from Thanksgiving that," I trailed off, unsure how to finish the thought. Liam leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. "I had my suspicions," he admitted. "She's been distant, making excuses." But I didn't want to believe it. Neither of us cried. Maybe we were too numb, too shell-shocked to process the full weight of it. Instead, we made a pact: we would confront them, together. The confrontation came on a Sunday afternoon. Andrew and I were hosting a small family barbecue, an ordinary event that, in hindsight, felt almost cruelly ironic. Marissa and Liam arrived together, their kids in tow, and the air was heavy with unspoken tension. I had thought I'd feel nervous, but as the moment approached, I was strangely calm. I had rehearsed this in my mind 100 times. When Andrew stepped away to grab more drinks, I followed him into the kitchen. "Andrew," I began, closing the door behind me. "We need to talk." He turned, a bottle of beer in his hand, and frowned. "Now? Everyone's outside." "Yes. Now." My voice was steady, firmer than I thought it would be. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the photos Lisa had given me, placing them on the counter between us. His eyes darted to them, and in that instant, I saw his mask slip. The confident, easygoing demeanor he wore so well cracked, revealing a flicker of panic. "What is this?" he asked, though the color draining from his face told me he already knew. "You tell me," I replied, my voice laced with quiet fury. "How long has this been going on, Andrew? And don't you dare lie to me." He stared at the photos, then at me, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's complicated." "No," I snapped. "It's not. You lied to me. You cheated. And you didn't even have the decency to be discreet about it." The kitchen door swung open, and Marissa stepped inside. She froze when she saw us, her eyes darting to the photos on the counter. Liam followed a moment later, his jaw tight. The four of us stood there, the silence crackling with tension. "You two are unbelievable," Liam said finally, his voice low and angry. "Did you really think we wouldn't find out?" Marissa's eyes filled with tears, and she turned to Andrew. "You told me you were going to handle this," she whispered. "Handle this?" I repeated, incredulous. "You mean the part where you've been sneaking around behind our backs? Or the part where you've destroyed 2 families? Andrew held up his hands, as if to calm the room. "Look, I didn't mean for this to happen." "Spare me," I interrupted. "You don't accidentally cheat, Andrew. You made a choice." Over and over again. The confrontation devolved into chaos, voices overlapping as accusations and half-hearted apologies flew back and forth. Marissa sobbed, Liam stormed out, and Andrew begged me to let him explain. But I had nothing left to say. When the dust settled, I found myself standing in the kitchen alone, staring at the photos on the counter. They felt heavier now, like they carried not just proof, but the weight of everything I'd lost. That night, Andrew slept on the couch. I lay awake in our bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the day. There was no going back now. The life we'd built was shattered, and the pieces were too sharp to pick up without bleeding. In the darkness, a single thought echoed in my mind: this is just the beginning. The house felt impossibly quiet the morning after the confrontation. Andrew hadn't stirred from the couch, and I didn't bother waking him. I moved through my morning routine in a haze, the silence punctuated only by the clinking of dishes and the faint hum of the coffee machine. The confrontation had gone exactly as I'd expected, ugly, chaotic, and final. There was no room left for excuses or half-truths. Andrew and Marissa's betrayal was laid bare, and I couldn't unsee it. I didn't want to. When Andrew finally woke, he hovered in the doorway of the kitchen, watching me as I poured my coffee. I didn't acknowledge him. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice hoarse from sleep, or maybe from the previous day's shouting match. I turned, leaning against the counter, and crossed my arms. "About what, Andrew? About how you lied to me? How you destroyed everything we built for this affair?" He flinched, but his gaze didn't waver. "I made a mistake." I laughed, a hollow sound that echoed in the empty room. "A mistake? Andrew, a mistake is forgetting to pick up milk. What you did was deliberate." He stepped closer, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But we can fix this. We can go to counseling, work through it." "Work through it?" I shook my head, incredulous. "Do you even hear yourself? You didn't just betray me. You betrayed us. And you didn't even have the decency to tell me the truth. I had to find out like this." He opened his mouth to argue but stopped, his shoulders sagging. For the first time in a long time, he looked defeated. "Do you love her?" I asked, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. His silence was answer enough. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of that truth settle over me. "You should pack a bag," I said finally, my voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "Go stay somewhere else for a while." "Where am I supposed to go?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "I don't know, Andrew. That's not my problem anymore." The next few days passed in a blur. Andrew moved out that evening, leaving with nothing but a hastily packed duffel bag and a mumbled promise to check in about the logistics. The house felt emptier without him, but also lighter, like I could finally breathe without the weight of his lies suffocating me. I threw myself into the practicalities, changing the locks, notifying a lawyer, and figuring out how to tell my family and friends. Each task felt monumental, but also necessary, a way of reclaiming control in the midst of chaos. The hardest part was explaining everything to my parents. My mom's voice cracked when I told her, a mixture of heartbreak and anger evident in every word. "How could he do this to you?" she asked, her tone thick with disbelief. "I don't know, Mom," I replied, my own voice shaky. "But it's done. There's no going back." My dad, ever the quiet one, simply said, "We're here for you. Whatever you need." Their support was a lifeline, but it also reminded me of the enormity of what I'd lost. Andrew had been part of my life for over a decade. He wasn't just my husband, he was my best friend, my partner, the person who knew me better than anyone. Or so I'd thought. Now, I was left to navigate the wreckage alone. Marissa's fallout came swiftly. Word spread through the family like wildfire, and it wasn't long before everyone knew what had happened. Her husband, Liam, wasted no time filing for divorce. He moved out of their home and left her to deal with the aftermath. She called me once, late at night. I stared at her name flashing on my screen, a wave of anger and disgust rising in my chest. I let it ring out. Whatever she had to say, I didn't want to hear it. Instead, I texted Liam. "She just called me. I don't know why, but I thought you should know." His response was immediate. "I'm sorry she's dragging you into this. I'll talk to her." We didn't speak often after the barbecue, but there was a quiet understanding between us. We were both mourning something, the people we thought we knew, the lives we thought we had. It wasn't camaraderie exactly, but it was something. By the end of the week, Andrew reached out again. He wanted to talk about moving forward, as if this were a business deal that just needed a fresh proposal. "I think we need to figure out a plan," he said during one of our phone calls. "For the house, the finances, everything. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that he'd lost the right to negotiate when he broke our vows. But instead, I kept my tone even. I've already spoken to a lawyer, I said. We can go through mediation if you'd prefer, but either way, I'm filing for divorce. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost pleading. Are you sure this is what you want? What I want? I repeated, incredulous. Andrew, this isn't about what I want. It's about what you did. And I'm done. Hanging up that call felt like closing a chapter of my life, one that I had clung to for far too long. The pain was still raw, but there was a small, flickering sense of relief too. For the first time in months, I could see a path forward, one where I didn't have to carry the weight of his betrayal. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was mine. The days stretched into weeks, and a new kind of routine began to emerge. The mornings felt the same, coffee brewing, the sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, but everything else was different. Andrew's absence echoed through the house, and while I missed the life we'd built, I didn't miss the lies that came with it. I'd been thinking a lot about who I was before him. There was a time when I wasn't someone's wife, when my world didn't revolve around managing schedules, planning meals, or cleaning up someone else's messes. Somewhere along the way, I'd become so wrapped up in being Andrew's partner that I'd forgotten how to be me. Now, standing in the wreckage of our marriage, I realized I had a chance to find her again. Andrew wasn't making it easy. Though he'd moved out, he seemed to linger in every corner of my life, texting about bills, sending messages about shared responsibilities, and asking if we could just talk. He was trying to maintain some level of control, even as everything unraveled. One night, he showed up unannounced. I was curled up on the couch with a book, the quiet of the evening wrapped around me, when the sound of his knock shattered the stillness. I opened the door to find him standing there, looking tired and disheveled. His eyes held a mixture of regret and desperation that made my stomach churn. What are you doing here, Andrew? I asked, my voice firm. I needed to see you, he said, running a hand through his hair. Can I come in? I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to say no, but some part of me, a remnant of the woman who once loved him, stepped aside. He entered the living room, his presence heavy and uncomfortable. I've been thinking about everything, he began, sitting on the edge of the armchair across from me. About us. About what I've done. Have you? I replied, crossing my arms. Because it doesn't seem like you've taken much time to think about the consequences. He flinched, but pressed on. I know I hurt you. I know I destroyed what we had. But I'm trying to make things right. I let out a bitter laugh. Make things right? Andrew, you can't fix this. You can't undo what you've done. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said quickly. I want to be honest with you. I owe you that much. The irony of that statement wasn't lost on me. Okay, I said. Be honest. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. It wasn't just Marissa. The words hung in the air like a grenade, the weight of them threatening to crush me. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what he'd just said. What? I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. There were others, he admitted, his voice cracking. Before her. It didn't mean anything, I swear. But Marissa, it was different. My heart felt like it had been ripped from my chest. All this time, I'd thought the betrayal was contained, something I could pinpoint and dissect. But now, I realized it was a pattern, a rot that had been festering beneath the surface of our marriage for years. I stood abruptly, needing to put space between us. You need to leave, I said, my voice trembling. Please, just let me explain. No, I snapped, cutting him off. I don't want to hear it. Get out. He looked at me for a long moment, as if searching for a shred of hope, but there was none left to give. Finally, he rose and walked to the door, his shoulders slumped. I'm sorry, he said softly before leaving. As the door closed behind him, I sank onto the couch, my chest heaving with sobs. This wasn't just about Marissa. It was about all the lies, all the choices he'd made without considering the damage they'd cause. The man I thought I knew had never existed. In the days that followed, I threw myself into reclaiming my space. I boxed up the remnants of Andrew's presence, his clothes, his books, even the framed photos of us that had once adorned the walls. I donated what I could, trashed the rest, and filled the empty spaces with things that felt like mine. I started seeing a therapist, a woman named Karen with kind eyes and a calm demeanor. Our sessions became a safe space to unpack the pain, the anger, and the lingering sense of betrayal. Why didn't I see it sooner? I asked one afternoon, tears streaming down my face. How could I have been so blind? Karen leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. You trusted him. That's not blindness, that's love. But now, you get to decide how to move forward. This isn't the end of your story. It's the beginning of a new one. Her words stayed with me, echoing in the quiet moments when the grief threatened to consume me. Slowly, I began to believe her. This wasn't the life I had planned, but it was mine to rebuild. The first step to moving forward was reclaiming the parts of my life that Andrew had overshadowed. For too long, I had let his needs and wants dictate my decisions, molding myself to fit into his version of what our marriage should be. But now, with the truth laid bare, I had the freedom to rediscover myself. I started small. First, I took a weekend trip, just me. It wasn't far, just a quiet bed and breakfast by the lake. I spent hours walking along the shoreline, letting the rhythm of the waves soothe the chaos in my mind. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to check my phone constantly or rush back to someone waiting for me. There was no guilt in being alone, just peace. That weekend, I made a list. Not of goals, but of the things I'd once loved that had fallen by the wayside. Painting, yoga, the way I used to lose myself in novels for hours. I promised myself that I would start reclaiming those joys, one by one. Andrew didn't stay gone for long. Though he was living in a small apartment across town, he seemed to find excuses to reach out, texts about bills, emails about our lawyer's progress, even calls to ask about things he could have easily figured out on his own. At first, I responded out of necessity. Divorce required a certain level of communication, and I wanted to keep things civil. But his messages became more personal, veering into the territory of regret and nostalgia. Remember our trip to the cabin in the mountains? One text read. That was one of my favorite memories. Another time, he called after seeing an old photo of us pop up in his social media memories. You looked so beautiful that day, he said, his voice tinged with longing. I hated how those moments made me feel. They stirred something in me, not hope, but a deep ache for the life we'd once shared. For the woman I'd been before the lies. But I also knew better. Nostalgia was a dangerous thing, a rose-colored lens that could blur the sharp edges of reality. So, I began setting boundaries. I told Andrew that our communication should remain strictly about the divorce or the logistics of splitting our lives. Anything else, I ignored. Marissa wasn't faring much better. Liam had moved out, and word spread through the family like wildfire. Her in-laws were livid, the betrayal cutting especially deep given that it had come from someone within the family. At the last family gathering, she'd been notably absent, and no one seemed particularly eager to bring her up. Liam and I had kept in touch sporadically, mostly through short, polite texts. Once, he called to ask about some paperwork for the lawyer. The conversation had been brief but cordial, a quiet reminder that we were both navigating the same storm in different boats. One evening, I received a text from him. How are you holding up? I stared at the screen for a moment before typing back, one day at a time. You? His response came quickly, same. It's been weird, you know. Lonely, but also kind of freeing. I nodded to myself, understanding exactly what he meant. There was a strange liberation in being untethered, even if it came at a painful cost. Weeks turned into months, and the divorce proceedings dragged on. Mediation sessions were tense but civil, a carefully choreographed dance of compromise and restraint. Andrew seemed to think that if he played his cards right, I might reconsider. He even suggested couples therapy at one point, though I shut that down immediately. This isn't something therapy can fix, I told him. You made your choices, Andrew. Now, we have to live with them. Despite his protests, I knew he understood. The sparkle of his new life with Marissa had dulled, and I suspected reality was sinking in. They weren't the star-crossed lovers they'd once imagined themselves to be, they were two people standing in the ruins of their own making. One afternoon, while clearing out the attic, I came across an old box of letters and mementos from when Andrew and I first started dating. At the very bottom, tucked beneath concert tickets and postcards, was a photo of us on our first anniversary. We looked so happy, so full of hope. I stared at the image for a long time, tears welling in my eyes. I wanted to hate him, to despise everything about our time together, but I couldn't. There had been good moments, real ones. And while they were now tainted by his betrayal, they were still part of my story. In that moment, I decided to let go. Not of the pain, it was still too raw for that, but of the anger. It was exhausting, carrying the weight of resentment, and I was tired of letting it define me. I took the photo and placed it back in the box, sealing it shut. Maybe someday I'd look through it again, but not now. Now, I was focused on the future. The first time I laughed, really laughed, after everything happened, it caught me off guard. I was out with a friend at a small cafe, and we'd been reminiscing about our college days. She told a story about an old prank we'd pulled, and before I knew it, I was doubled over, tears streaming down my face from laughing so hard. It felt good. Healing, even. Like I'd found a piece of myself I hadn't realized was missing. As I walked home that evening, the air crisp and cool around me, I realized something: I was going to be okay. It wouldn't happen overnight, and there would still be hard days ahead. But for the first time in a long time, I believed it. This wasn't the life I had planned, but it was mine to rebuild, and I was finally ready to begin. As the months stretched on, the wounds began to scab over, though they still throbbed with a dull ache on some days. Life was quieter now, simpler in many ways, but the echoes of the past still lingered, like whispers in the corners of the house, memories tied to every room. The guest room had been converted into an art studio, a space I carved out for myself as part of my healing. The smell of fresh paint mingled with the sunlight streaming through the windows, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to Andrew or our marriage. With each brushstroke, I felt a little lighter, a little freer. But the peace didn't last long. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, my phone buzzed with a message from Andrew. It wasn't unusual for him to text about practical matters, but this one made my stomach sink. We need to talk about the kids meeting Marissa. I stared at the screen, a wave of anger washing over me. Of course, he would bring this up now, when I was finally starting to feel like myself again. He had a way of reappearing just when the waters were beginning to calm. I took a deep breath before replying, "We can discuss this at our next mediation session." His response was almost immediate, "I don't want to wait that long. Can we meet this week?" I didn't want to meet. I didn't want to see his face, hear his voice, or deal with the mess he'd created. But avoiding the issue wouldn't make it go away. Fine. Thursday evening. At the cafe by your place. When Thursday arrived, I walked into the cafe with my heart pounding. Andrew was already there, nursing a cup of coffee and fidgeting with his phone. He looked up as I approached, offering a tentative smile that I didn't return. "Thanks for coming," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. I sat down, folding my hands in my lap. "Let's make this quick." He nodded, his expression serious. "I think it's time for the kids to meet Marissa. They're going to find out eventually, and I don't want them hearing it from someone else." The audacity of his words stunned me. "You think this is about timing?" I said, my voice low but sharp. "You think they're just going to accept this, Andrew? That I'm going to let you parade her around like everything's fine?" I'm not parading anyone, he shot back. I'm trying to move forward. We both are. And that includes being honest with the kids. Honest? I repeated, incredulous. You want to talk about honesty now? After all the lies you've told, the secrets you've kept? His jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. I know I messed up. But the kids deserve to know the truth. I shook my head, the anger bubbling up inside me. The truth is that you betrayed this family, Andrew. The truth is that you tore everything apart for her. And now, you want me to be okay with you dragging the kids into this mess? He leaned forward, his voice softening. I'm not asking for your blessing. I'm just asking for a chance to make things right with them. I stared at him, my chest tightening. For all his flaws, he was still their father, and I knew I couldn't keep him from them. But the idea of Marissa stepping into their lives, of her playing any role in their world, made my skin crawl. I'll think about it, I said finally, rising from my seat. But don't expect me to make this easy for you. As I walked out of the cafe, I felt a mixture of relief and dread. The conversation wasn't over, not by a long shot. But I had set the terms, and for now, that was enough. That weekend, I called my mom and told her everything. She listened quietly, her voice steady but laced with concern. You're stronger than you think, she said. And you'll figure out the right thing to do. But don't let him bully you into anything. This is your family, too. Her words stayed with me as I mulled over the situation. Andrew was right about one thing, the kids would eventually need to know. But it would be on my terms, not his. I decided to consult my therapist, Karen, about how to handle it. She offered practical advice, but more importantly, she reminded me that I had the power to set boundaries. You're allowed to say no, she said. And you're allowed to take your time. This isn't just about him, it's about what's best for your kids. When I finally texted Andrew my decision, it was with a clear set of conditions. The introduction would be gradual, and I would meet Marissa first. If he wasn't willing to respect those boundaries, there would be no meeting at all. His response was measured, almost apologetic. I understand. Let me know when you're ready. For the first time in months, I felt like I was regaining some control over the situation. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't erase the pain, but it was a step forward. And for now, that was enough. The day I agreed to meet Marissa felt surreal, as though I were stepping into a scene from someone else's life. It wasn't a decision I'd made lightly, but I knew it was necessary. If she was going to be part of my children's lives, even in the smallest capacity, I needed to see her for who she really was, beyond the betrayal. We met at a quiet cafe downtown, chosen for its neutral atmosphere. I arrived first, my heart pounding as I took a seat by the window. I had rehearsed this meeting in my mind, prepared for every possible scenario, her defensiveness, her tears, her feigned innocence. But nothing could have prepared me for the moment she walked through the door. She looked different than I'd expected, softer, less confident. Her usual air of charm and self-assuredness was nowhere to be seen. She hesitated when she spotted me, then forced a small, nervous smile and approached the table. "Hi," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hi," I replied, keeping my expression neutral. She sat across from me, folding her hands in her lap. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching taut between us. Then, with a shaky breath, she said, "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." "I didn't do it for you," I said bluntly. "I did it for my kids." She nodded, her eyes dropping to the table. "I understand." I studied her, trying to reconcile this subdued woman with the one who had been so bold as to insert herself into my marriage. "Do you?" I asked. "Do you really understand what you've done? What you've taken from me?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked up at me. "I never meant to hurt you," she said. "I know that probably doesn't mean much, but it's the truth." I scoffed, leaning back in my chair. "You didn't mean to hurt me? Marissa, you carried on an affair with my husband for months. You lied to your husband, to your family. You knew exactly what you were doing. She flinched at my words but didn't argue. I made a terrible mistake, she said softly. I don't have an excuse. I just wanted to tell you that I'm sorry. Sorry? I repeated, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. Do you think that makes any of this better? Do you think that changes what you did? No, she admitted, her voice trembling. I just wanted you to know. I shook my head, anger and frustration bubbling beneath the surface. You don't get to be the victim here, I said. You made a choice, a selfish, destructive choice. And now, you have to live with the consequences. She nodded again, tears spilling onto her cheeks. I know, she whispered. For a moment, I considered getting up and walking away. This wasn't a conversation I had wanted to have, and it wasn't giving me the closure I'd hoped for. But something stopped me, maybe the small part of me that wanted to understand, or maybe just the part that needed to say my piece. If you're going to be in my kids' lives, I said finally, my voice steady, then I need to know that you're going to treat them with respect. That you'll never speak ill of me or use them to hurt me. I would never do that, she said quickly, her eyes wide with sincerity. I swear, I'll do everything I can to make this as easy for them as possible. It won't be easy, I said. But it's not about you. It's about them. She nodded, wiping her tears. I understand. I studied her for a long moment, weighing her words, her demeanor, everything about her. I still didn't trust her, not completely, but at least I'd made my expectations clear. I think we're done here, I said, standing. Good luck, Marissa. She didn't try to stop me as I walked away, leaving her sitting there with the weight of her choices. Andrew called me later that evening, eager to hear how the meeting had gone. I kept my response brief. She apologized, I said. And, he pressed. And I told her the truth. That her apology doesn't erase what you both did. He sighed, but I didn't care. This wasn't about making him feel better, it was about setting boundaries and protecting myself and my children. Did she say anything else? He asked. She said she'd respect my wishes, I replied. For your sake, Andrew, I hope she does. The conversation ended there, and I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt like I was taking control of the narrative, my narrative. This wasn't the end of the pain, but it was a step toward healing. And that, for now, was enough. Breaking the news to the children was the moment I had dreaded most. They were too young to fully understand the complexities of betrayal, yet too old for me to shield them entirely. Their world was about to change in ways I couldn't entirely soften, no matter how much I wanted to. Andrew and I agreed to do it together. As much as it pained me, I knew the conversation needed to come from both of us. They deserved to hear it from their parents, not through whispers or by piecing things together on their own. We sat them down on a sunny Saturday afternoon, the kind of day that should have been filled with laughter and play. Andrew shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his usual confidence replaced by an uncharacteristic nervousness. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. Mom and Dad need to talk to you about something important, I began, keeping my tone steady and gentle. Their wide eyes darted between us, sensing the seriousness of the moment. My eldest, Jack, frowned. What's wrong? Andrew cleared his throat. Well, sometimes, grown-ups make decisions that change things. Your mom and I, we've decided that we're not going to be together anymore. Jack's frown deepened, while Lily, my youngest, looked confused. You mean, like, you're not married anymore? She asked, her small voice trembling. That's right, I said softly. But that doesn't mean we don't love you. We'll always be your mom and dad, no matter what. Jack crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. Is it because of Marissa? He asked bluntly. The room went still. My heart dropped into my stomach, and I shot Andrew a sharp glance. How did he know? Andrew looked just as stunned, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Why do you say that, sweetheart? I asked, keeping my voice calm. Jack shrugged, but his expression was tight. I heard Dad talking to her on the phone. He said he loved her. Andrew's face turned crimson. Jack, Is it true? Jack interrupted, his voice rising. Do you love her more than us? No, Andrew said quickly, leaning forward. Absolutely not. I love you both so much. That hasn't changed, and it never will. Then why did you do it? Jack shot back, his voice cracking. Andrew looked at me, his eyes pleading for help. But this was his mess, and I wasn't about to clean it up for him. I placed a comforting hand on Jack's shoulder, tears welling in my eyes. Sometimes people make choices that hurt others, I said gently. But what's important is that you know this is not your fault. None of this is because of you. Lily sniffled, her lower lip trembling. Are we still going to be a family? Yes, I said firmly. It'll look different, but we'll always be a family. Jack didn't seem convinced, but he nodded reluctantly. Lily crawled into my lap, clinging to me as though I might disappear. I held her tightly, my heart breaking for both of them. That night, after the kids were asleep, I sat alone in the living room, replaying the conversation in my mind. I felt drained, hollow, like I'd poured every ounce of strength into holding myself together for their sake. Andrew called to check in, but I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to hear his voice, to deal with the weight of his guilt. Instead, I sent him a text, the kids know now. Don't let them down. His response came quickly, I won't. Thank you for doing this with me. I didn't reply. The days that followed were tough. Jack was quieter than usual, retreating into his room whenever he could. Lily clung to me constantly, her little hands always searching for mine. I tried my best to maintain a sense of normalcy, but I could feel the shift in our home, the absence of stability that Andrew's betrayal had created. I reached out to their school counselor, arranging for them to have someone to talk to. Jack resisted at first, insisting he was fine, but I knew better. Lily, on the other hand, seemed relieved to have another adult to confide in. Their healing wouldn't happen overnight, but I hoped these small steps would make the road a little less rocky. One evening, as I was tucking Lily into bed, she looked up at me with big, tear-filled eyes. Mommy, do you think Daddy will ever come back? My chest tightened, but I forced a smile. Daddy will always be a part of your life, I said. Even if he doesn't live here anymore. She nodded, but her little brow furrowed in thought. I don't like Marissa, she said softly. I stroked her hair, my heart aching at her honesty. You don't have to, sweetheart. You just have to be kind. That's all. She snuggled into her blanket, her small body relaxing. Okay, Mommy. I'll try. As I kissed her goodnight and turned out the light, I realized that her simple words held more wisdom than I could muster. I didn't have to like what had happened, but I could choose to move forward with kindness, for them, if not for myself. And in that quiet moment, I promised myself that I would. The months following that conversation with the kids felt like walking a tightrope. Every step forward was tentative, careful, and exhausting. But slowly, life began to take shape again. The chaos that Andrew's betrayal had unleashed was settling into something I could manage, something I could survive. Andrew stayed involved with the kids. He took Jack to his basketball practices and showed up for Lily's piano recitals, but the cracks in his shiny new life were starting to show. Marissa wasn't the beacon of joy she had once seemed, and it was clear their relationship had lost its luster. I wasn't surprised. Relationships built on betrayal rarely flourish. But I didn't take pleasure in their struggles, it wasn't my place. My focus remained on my own healing and creating a stable life for the kids. A year to the day after I discovered the affair, the divorce was finalized. The process had been mercifully smooth, Andrew hadn't contested anything. Maybe he knew he didn't have a leg to stand on, or maybe he just wanted to move on as quickly as possible. Either way, the papers were signed, the documents filed, and I walked out of the courthouse feeling lighter than I had in years. That evening, I celebrated with my closest friends. We gathered at my house, the space now fully my own, and toasted to new beginnings. There was laughter, wine, and a warmth that filled the empty corners of my heart. "You look like a new woman," my friend Mia said, raising her glass to me. "Strong, radiant, and free." I smiled, a genuine one this time. "I feel like I'm finally finding myself again." Closure came in unexpected ways. One afternoon, as I was sorting through some old boxes, I came across a photo album from our early years of marriage. The memories stared back at me: vacations, holidays, moments of shared joy. For a long time, I had avoided these images, afraid of the pain they might stir. But now, I found myself flipping through the pages with a surprising sense of calm. Those moments had been real, even if the man I'd shared them with had ultimately failed me. They were part of my story, part of what had shaped me into the person I was now. Letting go didn't mean erasing them, it meant accepting them for what they were and moving forward. I closed the album and placed it back in the box, a small smile tugging at my lips. The past was behind me, but it no longer held power over me. The final thread unraveled when Andrew called one evening, months after the divorce. His voice was hesitant, uncharacteristically soft. "Can we talk?" he asked. "I don't think there's much left to say," I replied. "I know," he said. "But I need to apologize. For everything." The words hung in the air, fragile and unexpected. I waited, letting him fill the silence. "I hurt you," he continued. "And I'll regret that for the rest of my life. You deserved better. The kids deserved better." He sounded genuine, and for the first time, I believed him. But his apology wasn't for me, it was for him, a way to absolve himself of the guilt he'd carried. And I was okay with that. "I accept your apology," I said finally. "But that doesn't change what happened." "I know," he said. "I just wanted you to hear it." After we hung up, I felt a strange sense of peace. His words didn't erase the pain, but they allowed me to close the chapter fully, without lingering bitterness. It was done. Today, my life looks nothing like I imagined it would 5 years ago. I've found joy in unexpected places: my art studio, the long walks by the lake, the laughter of my children as they adjust to their new normal. I've learned to love myself again, flaws and all, and to embrace the possibilities that lie ahead. Andrew remains a part of our lives, but his role is different now. He's the kids' father, and nothing more. Marissa has faded into the background, a distant figure who no longer holds any power over me. This wasn't the story I thought I'd be telling, but it's mine. And as I stand here, stronger and more grounded than ever, know this: I'm not defined by his betrayal. I'm defined by how I chose to rise above it. This is just the beginning of a new chapter, one that I get to write on my own terms.